Hello, Americans. Welcome to another episode here on Redeck News. Today we have with us Sarah McAbee, who is a J6 wife and has, a really heart-wrenching story to tell us today about the American justice system. And as you know, and our listeners know here on Redeck News, we like to explore constitutional journalism. And at the core of our system is whether we have a two-tier justice system, because no country works if people feel they're being treated unfairly. So today, I welcome you to the show, Sarah, where you can tell us the story about you and your husband, Ronald Colton McAbee.
Thank you for having me on, Barry. Yeah, it is. There is a two-tier justice system in America. If you just look at these cases for what they're worth, it's important that people form their own opinion. My husband and I, we lived an all-American white picket lifestyle before all of this had happened. We actually go far back. We've known each other for 16 years. We've been together 12 of those and married. We're going on 7 years. And, on January 6th, he was invited to DC by a friend at the time. And he went to air his grievances with his government, as we are allowed to per our constitutional rights. And that morning, he went to hear President Trump speak, and they made their way down to the Capitol, because what a lot of people still don't understand or know is how that transition happened from the ellipse to the Capitol. And there were other speeches slated to happen at the Capitol, and President Trump had said, peacefully and patriotically, make your voices heard. And so the mass majority went down to the Capitol. And when he was down there, he found himself at the Lower West Terrace Tunnel, in a place that many people would never want to be in. But him being a trained law enforcement officer of 7 years at the time, he ran into action instead of running away. And he went into the tunnel. He never went inside, but at the Lower West Terrace Tunnel, there was an officer that was down, and he went to aid this officer. And as he's trying to aid the officer that's on the ground, he gets assaulted twice. He gets hit in the head with a baton from one officer, and he gets hit in the shoulder and across the ribs with a baton by another officer. And as that's transpiring, off to his left, he sees Metropolitan Police Officer Lila Morris beating Roseanne Boylan, and he's trying to get her to stop. He's yelling at her, "Stop killing that girl." And while he's there over top of this officer trying to aid him, he's communicating with these officers saying, "I'm one of you. I'm trying to give help. Let me give help. I know how to do that." And unfortunately, the other protesters had a hold of Andrew Waite, who was on the ground. That was the officer. They had a hold of his legs. And so they successfully pulled him down the stairs. And my husband slid on down the stairs and was over top of him for about 20 seconds. And he was on his hands and knees protecting him from the crowd. And the crowd was irate because of the things that they had just witnessed happen with these police officers. They were calling my husband a traitor. And he's yelling, "No, quit, stop," because they were trying to grab his duty belt. They were trying to grab his gas mask. And he asks the officer if he was ready. And then the officer says, "Get off of me." He said, "I'm helping you." He said, I know, help me up." My husband rolls him over to his side, takes him back up to the line of officers to get medical attention. Then he goes to find Roseanne Boylan because people had moved her away from the police line. He's looking through a bag of medical supplies, goes to check her pulse, and him and 4 other Good Samaritans decide to pick up her body and take it back to the line of officers to try and get medical help. And as they're there, the gentleman who was giving her chest compressions was worn out and said, "I need compressions." So my husband tells everybody to back out. He starts to give her chest compressions as they drag her away like she's a dead animal. And the crowd disperses. They're really angry with the police. They're yelling at them. And Colton's just standing there in such disbelief of what he had just witnessed. And another officer, Stephen Sagamont of the Metropolitan Police Department, thanked him twice for his help. And another officer in the line started to spray him with pepper spray. And he said, "I'm not hurting anybody. Stop spraying me." And at that time, the crowd surged up. And Colton's just standing there very defenseless. His hands are up and they can see that he's not fighting them. And that officer puts his arm around him and protects him from the crowd that had just surged. After the crowd disperses, there's another Good Samaritan that comes up, and the police officer asks her to help him get to a medical tent so he can get some attention for the injuries that he had sustained. And so for 7 minutes of his life, when he came home on January 7th and told me what happened, I thought he would receive some sort of award for jumping into action and helping the police officers in the midst of chaos. And instead, in August of 2021, they came for him and he was held without bond for 26 months before he went to trial. And then after he went to trial, he was found guilty on all counts, 6 felonies and a misdemeanor, by a jury not his peers. And he was sentenced this year, February 29th, 31 months after being incarcerated. And the judge sentenced him to 70 months in total.
Wow. I mean, I'll be honest, Sarah. I've interviewed a lot of people over the years. I've been doing this for 14 years, and I can't really describe the feeling I had before this interview. I try to sense it as nervousness, and you could probably even tell in my introduction. When I met you several months ago, it was so emotional because your story is so American. You and your husband is a sheriff, right? He's an officer of the law in Tennessee, and he sprang into action, but he was also there as an American, because he upholds the law in his day job in Tennessee as a sheriff. He was arrested, as I remember and have read, in the parking lot of the sheriff's office by the FBI. And you are just regular, and he has no criminal history, no criminal record. Obviously, you wouldn't be a sheriff if you did. And this isn't like a cop gone rogue that got a dirty cop that is, somehow in the mafia or something and taking drug money or something. No criminal record. But he is there expressing his fundamental, foundational, constitutional rights to protest what he felt like was maybe some oppression during COVID and an unfair election, which is allowed and hopefully expected under a constitution. So you never expected to be here. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for telling us your story today. And tell us a little bit about, what's happened, since Colton was arrested and kind of the process there. Because, as I said in the intro, if we have a two-tier justice system, it's the job of everyone and the press to shine a light on that. And I did a bunch of research before this interview, and I remember actually giving a speech in Boston in 2011 about when the Capitol was invaded in Milwaukee by Union protesters because of Governor Walker's, collective bargaining thing with the union, and they actually occupied it for many days, and they blocked the government from working and from Republicans to vote and all these other things. We had the St. John's Church that was burned up very close to the White House. And in the press, it's described as it was damaged. It was arson. It was damaged during mostly peaceful protests. We have this guy, Thomas Stark, June of 2020, that was angry about not getting a COVID relief check and showed up at a Republican senator's office in North Dakota, I believe, North or South Dakota, with an axe and tried to smash into the office. And he was prosecuted, and the U.S. Attorney's Office recommended 4 to 5 months of prison. He got no prison time, and he got a $2,300 fine. So here you are, and you told me, I think your husband was facing 14 years, correct?
Yes, 14 to 17 years.
And he ended up with 6. But let's go back to, first of all, did you expect the arrest? Did you have any warning that he was being investigated when they showed up at his work and the FBI arrested him in August of 21?
No, and I was actually out of town. I had left on August the 13th to go out of town, and I was on the West Coast, and I was trying to get a hold of him that morning, and I couldn't get a hold of him. And at one point, my call was forwarded, and come to find out that they were interviewing him, interrogating him at that time. And he had said, listen, you just forwarded my wife's call. Like, she's going to know something's up. You're going to have to tell her what's going on. And so I got a call from an unknown number. And when I answered it, they said, this is so-and-so with the FBI. We've apprehended your husband and we are about to raid your house. And so it was just a very surreal moment. And that
hold on. We just arrested your husband, and now we're going to go into your house and raid it.
Yes. Yeah. And they were there for about 5 hours. They took 14 items. And, it's just a very surreal moment that I wasn't even home. And at that point, you want to talk about how broken the system is from that point when I left on August the 13th of 2021, I did not see my husband again for 597 days. Because what they're doing to these January 6 defendants is
hold on a second, Sarah. You weren't allowed to see your husband for 596 days?
Yes.
Like, you can't visit him in wherever he was locked up? Nothing.
No. They no visitation, no video visits. These individuals couldn't see their.
What about a right to bail? Was he being obviously held without bail? Was he offered bail?
So
Bail hearing?
initially when he was in 2 weeks after he was apprehended, we went into a bond hearing in the Middle District of Tennessee. And within 5 minutes, the prosecution was playing evidence that was never turned over to our attorneys. So they were withholding exculpatory evidence, and we went into recess. Then we went back a week later.
When you say we, you still hadn't seen your husband. It was you and the attorneys? Where was your husband at this point in time?
Yes, he wasn't. We weren't even in the courtroom at the time. We were at the attorney's office doing all of this by Zoom still.
Oh, boy.
Yes. And so he was across the street in the courthouse where they had a media room set up where he had Zoomed into that. We were across the street, still couldn't see him. So a week later, we went in we had went into recess, and we were supposed to go in, and 2 hours before the hearing, the FBI agent called in sick on a holiday weekend. And so we didn't go back for another week. And when we went back, still the prosecution would never play the audio. They said it had no audio.
What audio is this? What audio are you referring to?
All the body camera footage. So everything that I had just stated, the 7 minutes of what happened, every single bit of that is on video, on the body camera footage. And him communicating with the officers communicating with him, it's all on there. But the prosecution never played it because it didn't go with their narrative. And so as they would go through the video, they would say, well, this is what's happening. But the judge in the Middle District of Tennessee, he wouldn't have it. And he said, listen, you're
and this is a federal judge at this point in time.
Yes, the Middle District of Tennessee, the federal district. Yes. This judge said, you knew about him for 90 days. You surveilled him. You surveilled his wife. You went to his workplaces. And now all of a sudden you're trying to tell me that he's a danger to the community, but you left him out on the streets for that long. There's just no way. So he said, with stipulations, of course, I grant him bond. And the government didn't like it. So they appealed that decision, and it went to at that time, the case was moved from the Middle District of Tennessee to Washington, D.C., where we were
it's over then.
Judge. Yeah, we were assigned Judge Emmett Sullivan. And within 5 minutes of the first hearing in front of him, he called him a terrorist on record. And so we knew at that point kind of what uphill battle we were facing.
The judge that is reviewing the bail appeal by the federal government in the hearing called your husband, who's up for the bail hearing, a terrorist.
Yes.
I thought judges were supposed to judge.
Yeah, that's
not
opine. But in Washington, D.C., it's a different story.
Well, I have been, and not to divert here, but I think this is relevant. I've been through and attended and watched a jury by trial in Washington, D.C. out of curiosity at how the system works. And I realized that it's not a jury of your peers, as you noted in your introduction. So, okay. So bail granted, overturned. You still haven't seen your husband. You're in Washington, D.C. because they moved it to, a friendly district, it seems like, where they got the government got the answer they wanted from Judge Emmett, correct?
Yes. Yes. And then from that point on, he was held without bond. His trial was moved 2 different times. He was on a case of 9 individuals. He didn't know his co-defendants at all. They just lumped them all together because they were in the vicinity, which also didn't make sense because there were people who were in the vicinity that weren't on his case and vice versa. And which is also it goes against our Constitution to have not only a jury of your peers, but when you're being tried, every person in that case is being tried. And so he ended up being the only one who did not take a plea deal. And he took it all the way to trial. And trial started in October of 2023, 26 months after he was apprehended. And we were in trial for a week. And
hold on one second before we get to the trial, because I want to talk about the conditions he was held in leading up to trial. You haven't seen him until the trial. Is that correct?
No, I finally got to see him in April of 2023.
And he hadn't gone to trial yet. And he had been
Correct.
held for 26 months, 590 days. Is that correct? Is that the right number?
597 days from the time that I had seen him, but it was 26 months from the time he was apprehended to trial.
And before we get to the trial, because I want to really dig in on that, talk about what happened to him in those 26 months. I had read about the diesel therapy. Could you explain to our listeners what diesel therapy is and what actually happened to your husband while he was being denied bail and denied access to see his wife for 26 months in the United States of America? This is absolutely infuriating.
Yes, so he was moved 6 different times. In the beginning, he was held in 2 facilities in Kentucky.
And
Then
this
he
is what diesel therapy is, correct?
Yes. And then he went to Oklahoma, and then he was in 2 facilities in DC, and the last one where he stayed at for quite some time. But with diesel therapy, the government quite literally kidnaps you. Your family doesn't know where you are. I only know he's being moved because another inmate would call me because he would ask them to, or that he wouldn't call. And so I knew that he was in transit, but I didn't have any way to follow where he was. There were times where it was up to a week before I had heard from him. I didn't know where he was at. And while he was in Washington, D.C., and so they do diesel therapy as a form of punishment. Because when you're in transport, you're never put in general population. So you're being housed in the segregated unit or the drunk tank. And so during that time period, he was sleeping on the floor with a mat with a bunch of other people. And then they would take them and what they call Con Air, what they fly on. They're shackled ankles, waistband, and their hands are shackled to their stomachs, and they have a black box on their hands. So they quite literally can't even move. And the U.S. Marshals transport them on planes, and then they transport them on buses to get to their facility. And so when he was in Washington, D.C., he had finally landed there a few months into this, and he was being housed in what we called the Patriot Wing with all the other January 6 defendants. But when he got there, they were on lockdown. They were on solitary confinement lockdown, even though that pod was a pod that many of these individuals had been in for months. And so they were on, at one point, they were on 24/7, meaning they were locked in their cells 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They got out to take a shower every so many days and could make one phone call. And then it went to 23/1, meaning they were locked in their cells 23 hours a day and they were allowed out once. But when I say 23/1, it could be longer than 23 hours because sometimes they were let out in the mornings and then sometimes they were let out in the afternoons. And so it kind of just depended on the schedule. And then after a while, they went to 19/5. So they were in their cells 19 hours, let out for 5. And that was that way for a very long period of time. And during that period of time, anytime they were out of their cells, they had to wear a COVID mask. Mind you, you think of what a 2-story living room looks like, and that's where they have been housed in their cells and in this day room. And so he had been there for a year. And on September 5th of 2022, he walked out of his cell in the morning. He was let out of his cell to go get his medication. And he didn't wear a COVID mask because he walked 25 feet to the medication cart to take oral medication. And while he was walking out, a lieutenant that wasn't supposed to be in there because it was a holiday, admin staff wasn't in there. She was in there causing problems. She told him to put a mask on, and he said no, and he walked around her to the medication cart. And she told the nurse to refuse his medication. He asked for his medication, and she said, "You're not getting your medication until you put a COVID mask on," and proceeded to spray him with OC spray, which is a more potent form of bear mace. And within an inch of his face, sprayed the entire can, told the pod officer to handcuff him. They handcuffed him, threw him on the ground, and she released another can of OC spray on his face. And the pod at that point got into an uproar. They took him out of the pod and they took him to medical. And in medical, they put him in a shower. And he said, "Sarah, the best way to explain it to you is you hop into a hot tub after a sunburn." That's the way it felt, them putting him in a shower. They put him in the shower and they put him back in the same clothes that was contaminated. And they took him back to the pod and put him in a cell by himself, voided of surveillance footage. And they left him in there for over 8 hours without a shower. And the the contamination from what was still on his skin and the contamination on his clothes reactivated, and he was begging for a shower and they wouldn't let him shower. Then they threw him into solitary confinement for 2 weeks, and their way of taking care of it was to kick him out. So he went on another round of diesel therapy for about 6 months before he ended up back in the DC jail. And so those are just, when they talk about the process as the punishment, it absolutely is the punishment here. When you've been held without bond, when you've had no prior convictions and no reason for them to hold you, when you haven't been able to see your loved ones. So anybody that was housed in DC, they were not able to see their loved ones for 2 years. No video visits, no in-person visits. And then finally, congressional member Troy Nehls went in January of 2023 and granted them in-person visitation. But during that time period, they always had to wear a COVID mask if they wanted to come out of their cells to spend the day in their few hours in the day room. They were not allowed to trim their nails, couldn't get nail clippers. They were not allowed to cut their hair. When I saw my husband, I couldn't believe how long his hair was, because they would not let them cut it. They were not allowed to trim their beards. They were not allowed to have religious services, anything that we would.
Hold on. They're denied religious services?
Yes, they were denied religious services because they were not allowed to leave that area, that pod that they were in, because they were January 6th defendants.
I can't believe this is America. So this is his punishment after a federal judge in Tennessee granted him bail, because this is a person with no criminal history who's actually a law enforcement officer who much of the evidence will say he was actually acting, responding positively to the situation on J6 versus negatively. The government referred it to DC to get the answer they wanted. They want it, and now he's 597 days without bail. So now you get to finally see him in April of 2023. And then that for the first time. What was that like?
It was behind glass for 30 minutes. So I traveled all the way to DC from Nashville for a 30-minute visit behind glass.
That's it.
That's it.
And then what was it like? And then he went on trial the following September. So this past September of 23, correct?
Yes. Actually, it was October. The beginning of October of 2023, he started the process. And the Vidir process was something just in itself is
the what process? Sorry?
The Vidir, when they choose, it's called the Vidir process when they choose the jury. And so they go through 70 individuals and ask them about 26 questions, and they write it down on their note card. And then they come back and go through them individually as they're under oath on the stand. And the majority of them said, I cannot get past my biasness of January 6th. I'm a victim. I've seen it in the news. And I've watched the hearings, the select committee hearings, and it didn't matter. They still put these individuals on the jury pool. And so there ended up being 14 total jurors, with 2 being alternates. And in that, 4 or 5, I can't remember, it was 4 or 5 of those jurors had already sat on a criminal case the week before. So they were sifting through, because the jury is only anybody that lives in DC. But mind you, if anybody was in DC on January 6th, within the vicinity of the 10 square miles, they were named a victim in these cases. So the jury, the judge, most of the time the prosecution, if they're out of DC, and most of the time the defense attorneys are all named victims in these cases, yet these are the ones that's deciding the fate for the defendant.
I've been through a trial, as I said, in DC, and I do know, and I've watched the jury selection or the results of jury selection, and I do know that 90%, it was over 92, like maybe 92% of the population of Washington, D.C. voted against Donald Trump. And this, of course, J6 is associated with the former president. So that's tough to get a fair trial when, as you say, and I didn't know this information. So they're all considered aggrieved victims if they were within 10 miles of the protest.
If they were in Washington, D.C., anywhere within Washington, D.C. on January 6th, they are named victims in these cases.
Okay, so you've got a jury selection. You've got, obviously a jury that 5 of them have just gone through the process. I'm assuming the people in the process before got convicted as well?
Yes.
Yes. So this was a fait accompli. So, and how many times did you get to see your husband before the trial, leading up to trial, after 30 minutes behind glass? Did you ever get to see him in person?
Yeah, I finally, when he got moved back to DC, I could see him in person for 1 hour. And I have seen him, I guess at that point I had seen him 4 times total,
Four
including the behind
times.
the glass visit. Yes, at this point I have seen him 7 times since this, it was about this time last year that I was able to see him for the first time.
It's absolutely heartbreaking. So you get a jury. You've seen your husband 4 times. What kind of legal representation do you have?
We had a public defender, but I will not dog on this public defender. I actually sing his praises. He was one of the best that I have ever seen, even private attorneys. He fought for him tooth and nail for his rights. And, at one point, the prosecution never called the third officer that thanked him for his help, because after they interviewed him, they realized it wasn't going to go for their narrative. So we had to call that officer to the stand. That officer testified to what was in the video as to be true. The officer that he was helping, that was down on the ground, that every time he went to pick him up, they charged him with assault. That officer that in the video acknowledges him, says, I know, help me up, sat on the witness stand and said, I don't know what the other voice is saying. And there was another protester that helped me up the stairs that got in between the defendant and I. And there's no video evidence of that. There is not a third person that comes to help him. It's my husband that helps him up the stairs. And so you have all of these irregularities in the trial itself. And then on the second day of deliberation, now mind you, we had been in trial for 5 days, 2 days of the video process and 5 days of trial. And we're sitting there, and in closing arguments, the prosecution, they do their closing arguments. The defense does their closing arguments. And then the prosecution has one more time to go and have the last and final word. In the last and final word, the prosecution said something along the lines of, and don't take me verbatim, I don't have the transcripts yet, but as I sat in the courtroom and heard the prosecution say, well, maybe he did help an officer that day, and maybe he did try to save Roseanne Boylan's life, but that does not change the facts of this case. And that is why you need to find this defendant guilty on all charges.
And so what
I'm
are
sorry.
the facts of the case?
Exactly. What are the facts of the case? That he took the stand and told you exactly what happened that day, that he had a report that he had written days later as a trained officer does, and that story has never changed. The facts of that case has not changed. Yet for some reason, the prosecution said that. So then the second day of deliberations, the prosecution sent back hard evidence, a binder full of text messages from his phone that were never admitted into evidence. They sent it back to the deliberation room. And so the judge gets a question from the deliberation room that they realized that the electronic text messages that they sent back were redacted, and they weren't all of the text messages.
And these are your husband's texts.
Yes, but in the binder, they had a lot more. And so the prosecution sent that back, and we filed for a mistrial, rightfully so. That should have immediately been a mistrial. But instead of the mistrial, the judge said, well, I'm going to bring the jury in here and ask them one by one if they can unsee what they saw. And you know what they said? I can absolutely unsee what I saw. And then within 2 hours, they came back with a guilty verdict on every single charge.
And take us through the charges. What were the charges that led to, and also, so he got, and this was before sentencing, but the charges allotted to 14 to 17 years. Would that include time served or not? Or would that be on top of?
Yeah, no, he does get credit for the time that he has served, at that time, 31 months. The charges range from this civil disorder to, he never got the 1512 charge, the big charge that's sitting at the Supreme Court, because he waited till the week before trial to deny their plea deal. And so they couldn't supersede him with that. But they charged him with assault with a deadly weapon for wearing motorcycle gloves that he.
Hold on, what was a deadly weapon? Motorcycle gloves?
Motorcycle gloves. And they never had a shred of metal. Now, mind you, the entire time, from the time that it was in the grand jury through sentencing, the prosecution never said they were motorcycle gloves. They called them brass knuckles. And these motorcycle gloves are $17 you can buy on Amazon, and they don't have a shred of metal in them. And actually, they are the same gloves that the police used, and you can see it in his own evidence where somebody drops a glove and they pick it up and hand it to him. It's the same gloves that the police use in riots. So the police had them on that day. And he never used them. When he shoved the officer, after the officer attacked him, hit him with the baton across the ribs and the shoulder. He shoved him open-handedly, shoved him to create space. His feet never move. He never advanced on the officer, and he shoved him away, and they charged him for assault for that. They charged him with assault and they said that he is the one that pulled the officer down the stairs, which is not physically possible because his foot was in between the officer's legs. He could not have pulled that officer down the stairs even if he wanted to. And he ended up with 6 felonies and 1 misdemeanor.
Wow. Threw the book at him. So, boiling this down, and he was never, I'm assuming he's appealing, right?
Yes, we are in the appeals process.
And so I'm assuming he applied for release pending appeal? Or was he allowed
Yes,
to?
but yes, you can, but that's very rare that ever happens. When we filed for the appeal, they told us he's more than likely going to serve his entire sentence, but we still wanted to appeal because what they charged him with was wrong.
So no chance of parole, nothing.
I mean, there's a slim chance, but slim to none, and Slim just left town. So
yeah. So where's he serving?
So he's in transit right now. So we have no idea where his final destination is going to be.
And this was over a month ago.
Yeah, he'll be in transit for potentially up to 12 weeks.
So they're going to diesel therapy him one last time just for good old time's sake? Remind him who's in charge kind of thing?
So diesel therapy is more of a punishment. This is transit. So this is normal for when somebody, instead of, the U.S. Marshals and the Federal Bureau of Prisons not spending our tax dollars, putting people from prison to prison along the way and spending 1 day of travel for them, they will take up to 12 weeks to get him to his final destination.
And do you have any idea where that is? You're supposed to be within 500 miles of home, right? So you can visit him without too much.
Supposed to be.
Yeah, we'll see. So let's boil it down, Sarah, for all the Americans that are concerned. First of all, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry for everyone what you're going through. This is awful, and we need law and order. Your husband was an officer of the law. I'm assuming all his intentions were good. He was frustrated, like a lot of Americans, because they felt like there was a hand on the scale during the elections, and now it seems like there's a hand on the scale of justice. And I have a degree in Soviet studies from college, and I will tell you, one of the things about the old Soviet Union is that no one could trust the justice system to met out justice. And when you have that situation, then you lose trust between citizens. And if we don't have trust between each other, we don't have a country, as I kind of said in our open. So boil it down for us. You seem fearless. You're on the show talking. First of all, are you afraid for your safety from your own government right now?
Absolutely. Every day that I wake up.
Do you think you're being surveilled?
I absolutely know I am. But, that's not going to stop me because faith and fear cannot coexist. And I believe that's why we are where we are in a country, is because of apathy, because enough good people have sat back and done nothing for so long. And they still do nothing because it doesn't affect them personally. But if they're going to come after somebody like my husband, they're going to come after any person just because they can. And so we can't sit idly by and let these individuals get railroaded did bad things happen on January 6th? Absolutely. But it doesn't matter. There's very few people that are completely innocent of their charges, such as my husband. A lot of these individuals are overcharged and overpunished. As you've stated, there are several historical events that you can, compare these to. Specifically, in Washington, D.C. on January 20th, 2017, for Trump's inauguration when they overtook the city. Or you look at what happened in Washington, D.C. during the summer of 2020. Those are very similar incidences. It's the same district, same Department of Justice, same prosecutors, same police officers most of the time. And nothing happened to those individuals. Yet when you slap January 6th on it, you have a 99.6 conviction rate in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you nailing it down like that, Sarah, because I was talking to a friend last night, and I think that a lot of Americans have gotten apathetic, and this is a proven cycle. It's called the cycle of dependency. It was written about hundreds of years ago by Alexander Tytler, Scottish philosopher who was a peer of our founders. And our founders said in the Declaration of Independence, we have the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. And I feel like a lot of Americans are pursuing life and happiness, and they're skipping over the liberty piece. And liberty is something you have to fight for, because your government, every government over the history of time, ends up taking liberty from people that don't defend it. And it seems like that's what's happening here. Your husband has no liberty now, or maybe not a balance of liberty. Like, did bad things happen on January 6th? As you said, yes, of course. The crowd got out of control in certain situations. Did your husband find himself in a difficult situation at the front of a crowd and he tried to react positively to a negative situation? There's certainly, we could debate whether he should have been in that place at that time. I know that you would like to take that day back every day of your life that you wake up, but did the punishment fit the crime?
No, absolutely not. And I am glad that you brought that up, because that was one of the things that I struggled with in the very beginning. But I truly believe that these individuals were chosen for such a time as this. I look back on my husband's life and the things that led him to, endure what he has endured for this period of time. And I know if I asked him today if he would do it all over again, knowing what the outcome is, knowing he could potentially serve up to 6 years, his answer would be absolutely yes. Why? Because he did everything that he was trained to do. He helped an officer that was in distress, and he tried to save a woman's life. It didn't matter if it happened on the Capitol steps on January 6th in Washington, D.C., or it happened in the Chick-fil-A parking lot here in Nashville. He would have done the exact same thing. And so these are the cases that you have to look at and say, these individuals are the one that will change the justice system, hopefully, in the future, so it doesn't happen to other American citizens. They've had to endure this punishment for far too long. But I really believe that they will create change at some point.
Well, they're certainly martyring for the cause, because, taking a chunk out. I mean, this is going to be, you and your husband are around 30 years old, correct? You were just starting out a life
Yes.
together, just had built your own home, living the American dream. And this is going to be a 6-year plus chunk out of your life, which is, 20% of your life at this point in time or more. That's a big donation to liberty. So God bless you for taking that, because I know it's a sentence for you as well, Sarah. I know you live with this every single day. You can't hug the man you love. You can't go to sleep holding his hand at night like I do with my wife. And I feel so blessed that I can. And so thank you for your sacrifice. How can people support you, Sarah? Because I know you have a foundation now called Stand in the Gap, correct? So could you tell the listeners how they can support you through this journey and through this cause, support you and your husband and other defendants that possibly are being way over prosecuted for what happened on January 6th?
Yeah, out of this tragedy, we have started a nonprofit called Stand in the Gap, a January 6th foundation. It's a 501c3 where we are helping defendants and their families navigate this unruly journey that they're having to go on, because each day brings new challenges. And so for more information about what I do in particular, because there's a few things that I do to help January 6 defendants, not only in this foundation, but getting their voices heard, getting their stories out, you can go to sarahmcabee.us. That is my website, and it reads about my husband's story. You can follow the timeline on what's happening to him and get updates from there. But it also talks about the Real J6, which is an organization I co-founded, which is very political. And we talk about the politics surrounding January 6th. And then Stand in the Gap, our nonprofit foundation, where we help aid these families.
Awesome. So all of you out there that have listened to this episode of Redeck News, please support Sarah and the patriotic duty that she has as a wife of an American that is quite possibly a victim of a two-tier justice system. Thank you for being with us, Sarah. It was a real pleasure. And God bless you,
Barry.
for your sacrifices.
Thank you. God bless.